Hello and welcome to Bronze Age Monsters, the show where we wade into the weirdest and wildest waters of the comic books of the 1970s. I'm your host, Matt Howell.
I'm your other host, Jacob Malcolm. As many of you know, we started out as the Werewolf by Night podcast, and we are thrilled to have on the show the three writer-creators of Werewolf by Night, Roy Thomas, Gene Thomas, and Gerry Conway, as well as Michael Giacchino, writer and director of the Marvel Werewolf by Night special, which was just re-released in 1970s saturated color.
Yeah. Jack Russell's character is one that I fell in love with the second I laid eyes on him back in the back issue bins as a kid in the 80s. And we're so excited to not only have the opportunity to talk to these folks about Jack and Werewolf by Night, but to have them all in the same virtual room to do it.
Yeah, so this all came about thanks to our friend and friend of the show, Michael, who reached out to Gerry Conway after the special was released. So Michael suggested Gerry come on the show to talk about his experience writing the first year of Jack Russell's existence. So Gerry Conway really needs no introduction to most listeners of our show, but he is an incredibly prolific writer who's well known for his long run on The Amazing Spider-Man, during which time he killed off Gwen Stacy and introduced the Punisher. At DC, he co-created Firestorm, Power Girl, Jason Todd, Killer Croc. He had an 8-year run writing Justice League of America and so much more.
So Gerry suggested to Michael that if we're going to talk about Werewolf by Night's origins, we should probably get Roy Thomas on the show too. And it was Roy's manager, John Cimino, who then offered to reach out to Jean to get her involved, since they both created the character and plotted the first appearance of Werewolf in Marvel Spotlight #2. So we jumped at the chance to get all of the writers behind the creation of Jack Russell in one place. So like Gerry, Roy really needs no introduction, but he's a comics writer, and he was the man who took over the editor-in-chief reins from Stan Lee at Marvel in the early 70s. He's well known for bringing Conan the Barbarian to the comics world, and for a lengthy writing stint on X-Men, Avengers, and he also worked on DC's All-Star Squadron, a beloved title.
Yeah, I mean, Roy is the co-creator of countless characters, including Wolverine, The Vision, Doc Samson, Carol Danvers, Luke Cage, Iron Fist, Ultron, Yellow Jacket, Defenders, Man-Thing, Nighthawk, Havoc, Sunfire, and our favorites, Damon Hellstrom and Brother Voodoo.
Yeah, you could really just get some DoorDash while going through the list of stuff that he has created for different properties.
Seriously.
Yeah. So, like I said, we were joined by his then wife, Gene Thomas. She was a Marvel office assistant, which, as you're going to hear, sounds insanely hectic and incredibly crucial to these comic books coming out on time. She was a sometime colorist. She co-plotted and co-scripted this story with Roy. She also wrote for the humor magazine Crazy at Marvel. She wrote Night Nurse. She wrote for Our Love, and she wrote Spidey Super Stories, which is a cool story that I did not know the background of, that she had a background in education. So I learned some amazing stuff, as you guys are going to as well.
Yeah, just to have all three of them together talking, and with Michael there, I mean, it was unbelievable. So yeah, we had a blast. So enjoy the conversation.
Indeed. So as you can see, I'm Matt Howell, and this is my co-host, Jacob, and we just want to thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate your time. We started doing this podcast back when it was originally the Werewolf by Night podcast during COVID summer, when we were trying to keep our sanity. And
Yep.
I just grabbed the omnibus off the shelf and said, does anybody else love this thing as much as I do? Anybody want to talk about this? And Jacob said, I'll do it. And we've been doing it since 2020. And we ran out of werewolf to talk about. So we started talking about Son of Satan and Man-Wolf. And now we're talking about Brother Voodoo and some other characters. So we're just hanging around the 70s talking about supernatural characters that give us so much joy. And I can't believe I'm talking to you three right now. We're just we've talked about you folks on the show so much. It's absolutely surreal. So thank you again for being here.
And mostly all good things.
Yeah, for the most part, you know.
Change right there.
But yeah, I just wanted to start out by saying, you know, of course we have Michael here as well. And yeah, I know that the three of you have all seen the special, which was just re-released in color. And the color, Michael, would you describe the color as like a kind of a 70s saturated hammer?
Yeah, I mean, it was something it was funny because everyone who, when it was announced it was going to be in color, everyone was, what, does the director even know about this? And I was like, know about it. It's my fault. I did it. Like we did it a year ago. after we finished the black and white one, we said, oh, let's do one that's like in the Hammer horror vibe, really saturated colors, really just kind of go for it, make it still feel like film, but make it feel like it came out of the 70s. And with the idea that a year after the original release, we would just put it out there for fun for everyone. And that's what we did. So yeah, it was a labor of love, really, honestly. And I can't even believe they let me do it. So that was really nice.
I'm sorry I wasn't able to go to the showing, but I've heard that it looks really cool.
Yeah, it looks great. And I remember, even when working on this, because when I was a kid, I read Werewolf by Night. I read, and I still have a bunch of my copies from when I was a kid. So when I was with I had done a lot of work with Marvel, and when the conversation came up about directing and they were asking me what I'd want to do, the very first thing out of my mouth was Werewolf by Night. I was like, that's what I want to do. And they were like, what? Really? Like, of all of us, that's where they were just like, that was not at all what they thought it was my hope would be. But it really was, because I love monsters, and I loved monster comic books when I was growing up, and they really fed me. So I just want to say thank you to the three of you for creating that particular comic book and so much else as well, which kept us going as I was growing up. So it wouldn't exist without you guys. So thanks.
Well, it was one of Marvel's first, quote, superhero monster comics, so it was unusual for us too.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. But that's interesting that you say the first superhero monster comic. So was that sort of from the beginning the idea that, okay, if we're going to be doing monsters, we sort of need to correlate them in some way to what we do in this other part of our business, which is superheroes? Was there anything like that, or was it just do what you want?
We just figured, Stan and I, that we needed to reach out beyond the superhero crowd, and at the same time, we didn't want to reach too far out. We wanted to try to reach the people who liked, say, Spider-Man, and we wanted to reach the people who were reading Warren's comics like Creepy or whatever. I mean, most of these people had never heard of Tales from the Crypt, but they'd seen Creepy or Eerie or Vampirella and other things like that. And of course, one of the primary motivations was the fact that only in the past year, the comics code had been changed, after the Spider-Man drug issues and so forth, so that these various things that had been disallowed in comics since the end of 1954 were suddenly allowed again. And two of those very specifically included werewolves and vampires in the classic tradition of books that are like taught in high school. It's phrasing very close to that, which is kind of ludicrous. They were trying to make, in case somebody objected, they were trying to make it look like it was educational, I guess. And the first thing that happened was, by sheer coincidence, the first issue that Stan asked me to write of Spider-Man, because he needed to take 4 months off to co-write a movie script, was to bring the first vampire into Spider-Man, but he wanted it to be a super villain vampire. He didn't want a Dracula or something like that. He specifically, because Gil Kane and I were going to do a vampire, Dracula. We'd have just started Dracula, having him fight Spider-Man. But Stan said, no, I want a super villain kind of thing. And then out of that came Morbius, who was like the first of the kind of real superhero monsters for sure. And and then from that point on, I guess the second one, right, Gerry? I think Werewolf by Night was second. I was always confused and thinking that Dracula came first, because we'd been talking about doing a Dracula book earlier, but Werewolf actually came out a couple of months before Tomb of Dracula.
He was the first one to have his own book, or was a feature. So he started. I mean, as I recall, you'd been wanting to do a teen werewolf for a long time. I remember talking about I was a teenage werewolf, and that was like I presume one of the inspirations to push. For
you presume right. Yeah. Well, my idea, if there was an elevator pitch for Werewolf, would have been, it's Spider-Man meets I was a teenage werewolf. That was my whole, the whole inspiration, and so forth, and try to get the Spider-Man fans, if possible, with the same kind of storytelling,
right?
And at the same time to reach the monster fans who maybe weren't interested in. And the funny thing is, you think they were the same audience, and a lot of people did buy both, but a lot of people who like superheroes, myself included, were not monster fans. I never bought horror comics in the 50s when I was buying any superhero. I never bought horror or crime comics, but I liked the idea. I didn't want to write them. But I like the idea of kind of making them up. And then Gerry was there and he ended up taking over and being the writer of all these things and so forth, and of course, contributing quite a bit to it in the process. And Jeannie, of course, became particularly involved in, we probably talked over other things too, but in particularly became involved in the werewolf thing. I don't remember how we, who did what, but I know that we did it, that whole first plot, together.
People have been asking me for years who came up with the name Jack Russell. Because the Russell part.
You did, right? You did. You must have.
It's like, so.
Well, you wrote the script. I'm sure he didn't have a name in the plot. Did he, Jeannie? I don't think we ever came up with that.
I'm not sure. One thing I do recall is we did not take notes as we were plotting. It was all verbal. And then you remembered it. And went back and wrote it.
That's why we didn't take notes. We didn't have a pencil or a paper.
Yeah,
we did sitting outside the Coliseum or whatever that building is and just talking.
Yeah, and plotted in cabs, plotted on the street, plotted sitting outside a trade show. So yeah. Could I just say also that at that period of time, just as the code was loosening, also in the other culture, you had Dark Shadows with a vampire and a werewolf, which I loved. I didn't miss an episode of Dark Shadows. So maybe that was in my mind, but that kind of thing was just in the air.
It's so interesting. My mother loved Dark Shadows as well. She loved it, and she still talks about it to this day. But otherwise, I don't ever see her looking at anything that is horror based or anything like that, and yet she has these incredible memories of loving that particular show. I'm not
sure when that was on, but I do know, and Jeannie remember because she was often there, that when I was working at home a couple of days a week, writing and so forth, I only went to the office about 3 days a week at that time. And whenever that show was on, it was like between 4 and 4:30 or something in the afternoon, some kind of time like that. The office, Stan didn't know this, but the rest of the office had orders not to call me between that half hour, because I was going to be watching Dark Shadows. And because I'd heard about it because of Barnabas the Vampire. And then pretty soon, not too long afterward, they came up with, what was it, David Selby, the actor played
Quentin the werewolf. Yep. Quentin was the werewolf.
He was a young, good-looking heartthrob, too. I don't know, what years were those? Dark Shadows.
I want to say 67 to 73.
That was a little early.
Yeah, 71, 72, because I was finishing college just as Dark Shadows was going off the air. So I kind of remember that.
So when they
Central Park, Jeannie?
Pardon me?
You got these bushes, but where are you in the middle of Central Park?
No, it's a virtual background with a full moon. All right. Which I thought was so appropriate for the time.
She's transforming right now.
So with the loosening of the codes, was that an exciting time? Did you feel like, oh, this is going to open us up to do so many more interesting and different things? Because at that point, you must have felt like, okay, we're doing this over and over and over again. And did that allow you some freedom? And was that exciting in some way?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it was for me anyway, as a newcomer to the field. I felt fairly constricted, in the kind of stories. And some of the things were really silly. I remember one writer talking about some of the restrictions that, for example, you couldn't have zombies, but you could have ghouls, because apparently the code, whoever wrote the code didn't know what a ghoul was. And this writer said, you can't have The Walking Dead, but as soon as they sit down, you can eat them.
That was Denny O'Neil. That was Denny O'Neil's quip, was that. Yeah, they sit down, you can eat them. Yeah.
So, Gerry, you famously put a crack in the code by defending the fact that someone said Wolfman in House of Secrets. And he said, well, they're referring to Marv Wolfman. So if it's a person's name, can't we have Wolfman in here? Is that true?
No, I honestly don't recall, but it sounds like something stupid I would have said.
Marv said once that the code had given him trouble because they thought he was being cute by writing the story and having the name Wolfman and trying to get away with something. And Marv said, "It's my real name," you know.
I didn't want to mention
have much of a sense of humor, but you know.
Yeah, exactly. It sounded like it was all very technical. I do want to say that I did love that what you three did with your contribution to Werewolf by Night, because the other monster books, I love Tomb of Dracula and I love Monster of Frankenstein and all that, but you did really kind of, like you were saying, the Peter Parker meets a werewolf thing, because you have a teen with troubles, and that's the part that really drew me to the character as a kid reading it, was that he's this kid that's as messed up as every other kid, but he also turns into a monster. So you have the best of both worlds. You have a superhero and he's cursed at the same time with his abilities. So kudos to you on that. That was a great call.
Yeah, it was a good call. I mean, how are you going to? I mean, that's one of the ways that you try to bring the Spider-Man fans in. Is by making him relatable to those fans. And that was something we were able to do. Michael is as someone who was young enough to have actually read that book at the time. Did you find that you experienced that? I mean, that was something that.
Yeah, well, at that time I was a young kid, and I was actually more into monsters at that time than I was into superheroes. And it was really the monsters which led me more to the superheroes than the other way around. Because I grew up in Philadelphia watching Creature Double Feature, and me and my brother were just obsessed with that. So when I found a comic book out at this swap meet, and it was an older issue of Werewolf by Night, I was like, what is this? I didn't even know this existed, and finding that was like a huge eye opener for me. And then
I have to say that that invited Stan and the rest of us there, if somebody started reading Werewolf and that led them to Spider-Man instead of vice versa, that was just fine too. Dimes with dimes,
So, Gene, do you remember the day what do you remember about the inception of it all, like being brought in to work on this, and like what was that?
It wasn't that I was brought into work. Roy and I were out at the auto show. Okay. So a friend of mine from college was a model, and she was one of these people who, in a slinky dress, pointed out all the features of the latest cars at the auto show. And her company was Mercedes-Benz. Well, we both lived in New York. We did not have a car, of limited interest. We wanted to say hi to my friend, congratulate her on what a wonderful job she was doing, look at the Mercedes, and then we were bored. Right? Were we bored?
Absolutely. Completely bored. Completely bored. Kind of paid the admission to get into the Coliseum or wherever it was. So kind of wandered around and just kind of sat down amid the cars and on. It was outside. I remember it was outside
somewhere, and just
wall, but near the Coliseum. Yeah.
And Roy had this plot to do, so we talked through a plot.
I love it. It wasn't the first
time, right, JD? Actually, the first time we ever talked over a plot. Probably it was just maybe one of the. I'm sure that I had picked your brain from time to time before.
Often in cabs. Often when I had no place to go. I mean, there was no out.
Captive
you
audience.
You had to talk plot, or there was nothing to talk about in the back of the cab.
So, Roy, Gene, and Gerry, what I'm curious about now, Roy, you had talked about before that a lot of the inspiration from this came from the I Was a Teenage Werewolf movie that came out with Michael Landon in the title role. What Matt and I really love about Werewolf by Night, and what we feel is really different about it, is that it's a curse-based lycanthropy rather than coming from bites or coming from a failed science experiment like it was in I Was a Teenage Werewolf. So out of the three of you, who decided to do that? Because it's such a cool choice.
Well, I didn't think it was cool. I just couldn't. That was the only thing a guy like me could have thought of. I mean, the first movie I ever saw with any kind of theme like that would have been in 1948 as a kid, when I saw Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, which I saw before which had the Wolfman as Lon Chaney Jr. in it, years before I had seen any, before I had seen a Frankenstein movie, before I'd seen a Dracula, before I'd seen a Wolfman movie. Scared the hell out of me. It's still one of my favorite movies. That year had that and Mighty Joe Young, two of my favorite films when I was 7. But the thing is that, so I love the idea of the Wolfman, and then I was a teenage werewolf. Of course, that wasn't a real werewolf. He was some sort of psychiatric projection or something, But still, he ended up looking like a werewolf. And that was such a clever idea. So I thought, and we had a chance to go beyond, and we'd had Morbius, so I thought we ought to do a werewolf. And so I just naturally thought of the classic werewolf, and so the only thing that I think what happened is I had just a couple of things. I had the general idea, which is going to be 3 nights, the 3 nights of a first full moon of a werewolf, and so forth, an origin story. I had a title, which is I, Werewolf, because I wanted to be told in the first person. And Stan didn't like that title, so he insisted it be changed to, before I even got started, to Werewolf by Night, which I thought was kind of ridiculous. I mean, Werewolf by Day was not, something that
not an option.
would have been. So I figured, but okay, all I cared about was the first person narration. If he wants Werewolf by Night, it's okay with me. And I had a big, very general idea. And I remember sitting there and telling Jeannie, I said, I've been, I don't know, not exactly writer's block, but I just hadn't got around everything. Thinking about this, and and I sort of do the broad outlines. It's pretty simple, but then you got to get down to the nitty gritty of who is the kid? Are there other members of his family? How did he get this curse? How did this and that? And I didn't really have most of those things worked out in my head. So that's why I made sure that I credited Jeannie for on that story, because in a very real way, although she came up with the general idea was after, but she really contributed a lot to a lot of particular plot things that would not have been in there if the two of us hadn't, talked it out. I don't know if she remembers anything she contributed completely. I don't. I only remember those few little things I did, and then we talked it over, and we ended up with the story, and I was able to make my deadline the next day. That's all I know.
Well, I think the old European castles and the old idea that went through many, many movies and many stories is that somehow the Carpathian Mountains were very creepy, and there all kinds of things lived and grew and were perpetuated there for generations. And the villagers were always ready to rise up and with their torches and stones. So it was, I think it was just a trope that was in many movies and stories, and it just fit there.
But I was rereading it, because the funny thing is, it occurred to me when I was going to be on this, I should read this story. I don't remember what happens in it, because I didn't write it, and I write the final dialogue, so I didn't remember. I only knew that general gist of it, and then I started reading all these things, which I guess Judy and I tossed in, because then Mike Flug drew the pencils from that, and then Gerry wrote the actual script. We'll talk in a minute. But the thing is that he's got a sister. Lissa, a sister, which right away gives a possibility, if it's a family curse, there's a sort of a hint that she may be a werewolf too. And we were just set up. We didn't know where we were going with it. I mean, we just kind of vamping it. And, he's got an evil stepfather potentially, and his chauffeur who's a bad guy. I'm just assuming that Gene and I came with all these characters while we're sitting there trying to avoid, going back into the car show,
I did want to mention, because Gene, you mentioned the Carpathian Mountains and the Gothic castles and all that stuff that works so well. Gerry, I love that you literally transported the spookiness to Malibu, California, and had them rebuild the family castle on an island off of the coast. I thought that was the best of both worlds, because you created this thing that people referenced in the letters column for years called Malibu Gothic, that there's this sunny, bright, swinging 70s California, but when the night comes, that's when the demons and all the magic and the weirdness starts to happen. And I love that night and day duality that you created. But I wanted to specifically mention that we're huge fans of the Darkhold, which you introduced in one of the first handful of issues. Do you have like a specific inspiration, like a Lovecraft or Weird Tales or any like August Derleth or anything? Where did that come from? And did you have any idea that would become such a big part of the Marvel Cinematic Universe?
I mean, it's I don't know if it's obvious, but heavily influenced by the Necromonicon.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I had been reading a lot of Lovecraft recently, and I'm not a genius, you know, at coming up with ideas. So, you know, I tend to be influenced by what's happening around me and what I've recently, you know, encountered creatively. I mean, the whole Malibu thing was because I visited California. I'd been in LA, I think, in February of '71. So, you know, that's why Daredevil moved to San Francisco, you know. Yeah, I need an idea. I really like this place. Let's put it there. You know, that's sort of how my mind works.
Which was amazing. I remember when I first moved out to California and going to Malibu and thinking, this is where Jack Russell lived. Most people would have said, this is where Rockford lived.
Yeah.
But I was saying, this is where Jack Russell lived.
There you go.
Can I tell you about misremembering and how one's memories get really mushed up with things in later years? I really didn't realize that the whole thing was out in LA. I mean, in my mind, Marvel always took place on the East Coast.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean,
and the werewolf could easily be prowling Manhattan, Central Park, Westchester. Sure. You know, so, you know, it's funny in looking back over that. Oh, did we say Los Angeles? You know, in my mind, I always thought that everything took place in New York.
Oh. Well, in the early issue or two, it could have, you know, because I don't think we really, you know, delved or played with the California aspect of it until Mike Plug and I started talking about LA. But yeah. I just like the idea of moving our characters out of their comfort zone, you know, the reader's comfort zone, and putting some variety in, you know.
Someone wanted a research trip. Someone wanted a business trip.
Oh, yeah.
Would they give you those? Would they allow you? Like, if you said I had to do this thing, it's going to take place in California. Would they let you go research it?
Roy liked it too. Roy liked it.
Money, you want to pay for your trip, yeah. I put the La Brea tar pits into a Daredevil, but I paid for the trip and doing Genius out there and so forth. It would have been way to write it off. I had to go out research the La Brea tar pits, so you know, take it off my taxes. You know,
I would love to ask you about.
Since, as you know, the book was first. I take it right. It was penciled by Plug before I gave it to you to dialogue, I guess.
Yeah.
Is that right, Gerry?
Yeah, I think so.
And no, what I'm wondering is, and Gene, I don't remember, obviously, was it definitely set in, did it say it was set in Malibu, or is that just something you added in the dialogue and it did, and you know, and you couldn't really tell because it looks like California, but I don't know if Ginny and I did this or was this something you superimposed on it. It was actually could have been New Jersey. I don't know.
Yeah, true. Well, I mean, I often made mistakes like that, like when I killed Gwen Stacy off on one bridge and, you know, Gil drew a different bridge. And I've been asking for years, why does this look like the Washington Bridge or the Brooklyn Bridge? I can't tell. I don't know.
What were the deadlines like at that time? Like, if you had a story to deliver, what was each of your deadlines in terms of when you got, you know, what you needed to do? How long did you have to do it?
Well, that depended on the artist. Yeah, our deadline as for plots was keeping the artist busy, and then somebody along the line would slow it all down, and we'd end up with books that were late. So, you know, hard to tell.
Yeah.
So you collaborated most with Mike Plug on Werewolf by Night. Plug he wasn't prolific. He didn't do a dozen books a month, but his style is so incredible. I mean, I know it's influenced by Eisner because he worked with Eisner on some of the Army technical magazines and stuff. So talk about your relationship with Plug and how you guys collaborated on the book.
Well, I mean, obviously, Roy brought him on. He was. Had you been promoted to editor by that point?
No, this was right before that. This is right before that. But, I mean, I had some influence by that point. I mean, I had to prove everything with Stan. But we were looking, what had happened is that Plug had come in a couple of weeks before, maybe a month, probably less. And he had brought in this Western called Tin Star. It was a Western about a guy who has a tin star baby with a bullet hole in it or something in his pocket. No memory. He's got amnesia. And from there, you can take it anywhere, as Carmine Infantino used to say. Well, I love that idea. The Stan was interested in doing a Western. So we sent Plug home saying, we can't do a Western, but, we really like your artwork, and we'll try to find something for you. And within a couple of weeks, when the werewolf came up, it seemed right. And the funny thing is, although I always assumed, as you were saying, that he worked for, that he was influenced by Eisner, and I suppose that's the extent. But the funny thing is, I see work with his before he joined Eisner and so forth. And it seems that what happened is he was actually drawing like that and inking and everything before. And what Eisner really did was recognize, hey, here's a guy who already draws a lot like me. And that's why he hires. Not so much that he taught him, as he just realized that some sort of junior version of his. And therefore, it made it easier for him to work with him. So Plug evidently already had most of that style before he ever met Eisner. And that just made it, he could have, and we were just lucky, as Plug said later, after you'd done Man Thing and 2 or 3 other monsters, you guys always have me draw the hairy characters, he said.
So can I say something you ask about deadlines? Can I say something wearing my hat as one Stan secretary and to the office manager at different points?
Yes.
It was like air traffic control, getting those pieces from one phase to the other. And everyone was always a day late. So, of course, that piece had to be immediately rushed to the post office. And then, obviously, that person had to then do it quickly and rush it back to the office or rush it to the next person. So it was constantly, things were just flying around, and then add into there that you had to send something to the code, and maybe it had to come back to the office for changes.
Wow.
Like even something as simple as raising necklines. I mean, forget the blood and violence, but just raising necklines or making pants less tight or something like that. That had to be done, then rushed off to the next phase.
Wow. So it's not like today where you would just email these things or send it by,
there was no FedEx.
In between.
There was no FedEx. We did not use UPS. We used overnight mail, whatever. And I mean.
And did things ever get lost?
Sure.
Strangely enough.
Not too often.
Not a lot.
Not very often.
No, people would say it got lost in the mail, but in fact, really the mail was pretty reliable.
Yeah.
And you talk about plotting. Many of the plots in taxis had to do with my hopping into a taxi with Mr. Thomas there and taking a script to the post office, to the midnight post office, to the main post office, or the Grand Central post office, because they took
with the hope that the next day it would get to Brooklyn. That was the hope, that the overnight mail. If I went there at 1 o'clock in the morning or something, sometimes Jeannie would go along, and it'd just be a trip down there. It's 20, 30, 40 blocks. It wasn't like next door. This is to the main post office, and then and we were hoping, and sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't, that it would make it to Artie Simic out in Queens, or Sam Rosen, or later Joe Rosen in Brooklyn. Sometimes it made it overnight. Sometimes it still took another day. You couldn't depend on the mail any better than now. But
did you ever just drive it out there?
It was kind of a little late,
Would you ever just drive it out there, like, or have someone?
I drove something out to Artie Simic once, because in Queens, I remember taking a cab out there, but I got well paid for it because Artie knew I played poker. He said, I got advice for you on poker. He says, never draw to an inside straight. So I always remember that, that valuable advice I got on poker. But otherwise, no. When I lived in Brooklyn for about a year before I was married and so forth, I would take something to the Roses occasionally because they weren't too far away. But again, I had to take a cab. I didn't own a car, in there, and it wasn't like that convenient to go to. Mostly it was the mail. It was almost all the mail, or people coming into the office. Some of them came in a lot. Some of them, like Joe Sinnott, once didn't come in for 8 or 10 years. I didn't even see him until 5 or 6 years after I was working for Marvel.
Wow.
He was out on Long Island, but he just stayed there and inked and never came in.
Wow.
Holy cow. And
some of the suburban people must have had the same issue. They must have known which post office accepted stuff late at night. And I think sometimes the only times you saw people from the far out suburbs is if there was really a rush and they had to hop on the train or drive in and just physically drop something into the office.
That's
incredible. At least once, I working with Gene Colan, and Gene was a very nervous guy about keeping busy. And I ended up in a bar calling him with four pages of plot so that he would have some work the next day. And I was in a bar. So it was, I don't know how coherent this plot was for him. So, yeah, that was McSorley's beer hall down on Lower East Side. Famous old beer hall.
Yep.
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So Gene, how many titles were you overseeing at that time? Like when you're talking about everything coming in and out, how many are we talking about roughly?
Oh, it could have easily been 24.
Wow. Jeez.
So Gene, on top of those duties, you also have, wrote Spidey Super Stories and Night Nurse, which Jacob and I love.
I didn't work in the office then.
Yeah, okay. So you've had multiple roles,
different phases where I worked in the office and then wrote from home, things like that. And then with Spidey Super Stories, part of that was actually going into Children's Television Workshop because I had to do a lot of interfacing with the people there because they were very protective of their characters. Pardon me?
I said, better you than me. I know you always said that. We would have never made anywhere. You were very nice and tactical. I just would have fought with them all the time, and it would have got nowhere. So you were great. I just turned it over to you, and I never had to think about that book again. Thank God. And you did a great job.
So but I had a degree in elementary education. I had a double major in psych and elementary ed. So it worked out perfectly with me and CTW.
Yeah, you were perfect. The perfect fit for that job.
Yeah.
So we love Night Nurse as well. And
absolutely.
Just that whole line you guys did aimed at a female audience. We wish that was around longer because we thought they were all so great. But I just want to ask you, Gene, what was it like being a female working in such a male-dominated industry? Probably still is. But I mean, at the time, in early 70s, 72, 73, when that happened, what was that like? And what was that like, first of all?
Well, I don't think that in terms of the writing and anything that I did on the books, there was any problem. I mean, it was just getting the books done. But in terms of working in the office, I mean, nobody was overtly sexist, but there was just a different feeling in those days. I mean, one time John Reporton, who was 6'6", picked me up and put me on top of a filing cabinet.
That might not pass today.
No.
Okay, no, this little lady in a miniskirt try to get down from the filing cabinet. I don't know. I mean, today, would that be grounds for a lawsuit?
Yep.
But I guess everybody thought it was funny as heck. And somehow I slithered down, so...
And also, speaking of females in the industry, we have developed a time machine art crush on Petra Goldberg / Scotise. Do you have any memories of working with her at all? She just disappeared around 1989, and we can't find any details about this person, and we love her coloring.
She was when Len Wein and I shared an apartment in Queens. She was our next door neighbor. That's how we found out about her. She was an artist, and we were like, maybe you could do some coloring for Marvel. her artwork was a little weird, so that wasn't going to happen. But her coloring was fine, and she was very nice. She was in Germany. She married an American when he was stationed over there. Luckily avoiding Vietnam, and came to America, and then she did the comics for a while, and just so that wasn't her interest, which is too bad.
Yeah, we just felt like her coloring just defined the monster comics in a way. Like that's all we've done the last 3 years is go through these Bronze Age monster comics, and every time she would color one, we're just like, oh my God, these colors look so good. But yeah, we just haven't been able to find anything out about her. So yeah, thank you so much for just letting us know something about her.
I think there's one photo online that you can find of her. And just almost zero biographical information. So I'm assuming when she left around 1990, she went back to fine arts and just continued to work. We don't know. Okay.
Yeah.
We'll have to get a private detective on it.
I didn't know that. Thank you for telling me, Gerry. I didn't remember any of that. I probably never knew it.
And I was completely out of comics by then.
Yeah. She kept to herself. She was kind of a remote German. What can I say?
Yeah.
But when did she enter? She entered in the early 70s, didn't she? Or the 70s sometime? She may have left the 90s, but she was around there during that period.
Oh, yeah, she was around.
I don't remember. I think I met her, but I don't remember her, or anything particular. It would have been just a passing.
Yeah.
I feel like whenever we're gushing about how much we love the colors, it's her or Glennis that we just absolutely adore.
Every time.
There were a couple of colorists who really worked at it. And then there were several for whom, it was, how can I color as few panels how can I do as few much coloring in the different panels?
So when I was 10 years old, as my birthday present that year, my dad took me to New York City. I grew up outside of Philadelphia, but they took me to New York City because I wanted to see the World Trade Centers. And because, as 33, King Kong is one of my favorite movies. Then when the 76 one came out, I loved that too. So I wanted to see the Trade Center. So he said, I also have a surprise for you when we go up there. And it was me, my father, and his really good friend, Jack Slider. So once we finished with the Trade Centers, and I was like, well, what's the surprise? And they're like, we're going to take you to Marvel Comics. And what had happened was my dad's best friend, Jack Slider, had a friend who worked as an inker, and it was Jack Abel. So when we went up there, I got to visit, and I remember going through, I was a kid, I was 10 years old, but I remember seeing everyone drawing and doing these things and thinking to myself, like, wait, people pay you to do this? This is crazy, but I got to meet Jack, and I was wondering if there was any memories you have of him or anything you could share about him. Because it was a very special day for me, and I never got to know him that well. Beyond that, I
remember the name of the pseudonym he was working under when I came to work. I think he inked that first Iron Man story that I worked on with Colin, but he was doing it as Gene Colan was under a pseudonym.
I think it was Gary something. I don't.
Gary Michaels. That's it, Gary Michaels.
Really?
Artists had a tendency 90% of the time. They would name their names were their kids' two names, or like Mike Esposito had two of them, both names of different wives of his at different times.
Was that because
and the other one?
Was that because they didn't, working in comics, they wanted to keep their fine art?
They were tending in the early days when Marvel was a smaller company and their rates weren't as good and so forth. DC was Marvel became that way too, but DC was a very possessive company in those early days, and if they would keep you busy, they consider themselves, as they often said, the Tiffany's of comics, And so, of course, Tiffany's existed to get robbed, But anyway, but these people were technically freelancers. But at the same time, if you gotten wrong with an artist, with an editor over there, you were in trouble. Thank God the main person who ever got in a fight with an editor and had to go to Marvel was Jack Kirby. Thank God for that. Yeah. But anyway, so these guys were afraid if Gene Colan was drawing romance comics, and if they saw him drawing Submariner for Marvel, there might be some repercussions. He might not, his better paying work at DC might draw up, and Gene had a lot of alimony to pay. So, so he took the name Adam Austin, for all, and Gary Michaels was there, and Gil Kane was Scott Edward. That was a couple of kids of his. And as I said, Mike Esposito had those too. And, and it just a lot of different people had, it was a long tradition. Jack Kirby, Stan Lee, none of those were their birth names,
Mm-hmm. Wow.
But they weren't necessarily hiding. So these guys were hiding from the DC editors, who fortunately enough were so stupid they couldn't recognize Gene Colan's artwork if he just changed his name. Well, obviously, he got away with it.
Not very discerning eyes.
Yeah, the guy who got a book that was sort of Neil. He was one of the first, that Neil Adams, who began to insist he's going to do it under his own name, but he could kind of get away with it because he was Neil Adams.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, no, I remember that day going there, and it was just
he became a proofreader later. In later years, he and Flo Steinberg shared a space proofreading for quite a few years, I think.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. I didn't know he was a proofreader, but he became one later.
Crazy. So when you look back, or you see something like, the fact that this is created, this man.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there you go. Or even this, this like, for me, this is like, I could die happy now that these were made from something that I had a small part in, that you created. And when you look back on all of this, you see something like Werewolf by Night coming out of the drawer. Is that surprising, or is that just like, okay, there they are, now they're running out of ideas, they're going into the corners of everything they have? Or how does it feel? What's the, like, when you look at everything going on today in the comics world?
We always knew this stuff was good enough. Go ahead, Gerry.
Yeah, the whole thing is very surprising. We thought the business was going to collapse.
Yeah.
We were just happy to have jobs from month to month for quite a few years, I never thought ahead, I was just happy to be out of high school teaching. And as long as I could hang on by my fingernails in this other field that I loved, I was going to do it. Now Gerry, he made a choice between like trying to write science fiction and comics, and you sort of had to choose between two fields you'd been thinking about going into, right?
Yeah, but I love the comics more. I mean, it was for me, it was always my ambition, to work in comics, and specifically to work at Marvel. But as I've said many times, we seriously did not expect the field to last very long. Our sales were going down. There were no ancillary products really coming out. There were the cartoon TV shows. Then the Hulk comes out, and that was a big deal. Spider-Man gets his own TV show. That was a big deal. But the experience that people like us have now of going to conventions that are 100,000 people. I mean, holy gosh.
Yeah.
Contrary to Gerry's thought, I never had the feeling that it was a dying field. I mean, I knew it had been kind of, and before recent years, but once I was in it, I never thought of it as a dying field. I mean, that's not to say I wasn't just stupid. Maybe it was, but I never thought of it that way. It never occurred to me this is all going to run out. It was more a case of, could I hang on in it? Was I going to be okay in it? But it never occurred to me the comics field would die. But it could have anyway. I could have been wrong, as it turned out.
Yeah. Well, you were lucky.
I was just blind.
I was very concerned. I mean, around 1972, 73. Especially when books like Doctor Strange dropped in sales, and we were canceling books at 180,000 copies sell a month.
That's about right, because I remember Doctor Strange had a print run of around 400,000 copies or so, and was dropped. The last sales figure I remember was 42% of that, which is about 180,000. They send up rockets, to sell that many copies these days.
Yeah.
Of course, the economics have changed because now they saw $30 for a comic practically.
Feels like it.
So, Roy, how were the sales for Werewolf by Night? I know it lasted 42 issues, and it seemed like one of the most.
I don't really remember. I mean, I saw the figures, but from time to time, I'd remember some particular figure or a sales figure or a percentage, but I didn't pay too much attention. I just knew it sold pretty well. The proof of the pudding is in the fact that after about two or three stories, it got its own comic. And, that was the proof. I mean, if it hadn't, we had other ideas, the Golem and other things that went 2 or 3 issues and then they got dropped or didn't last. The fact that it went on and it lasted for several years anyway. All those books kind of ran out of steam after a few years, but but in the meantime, they had a good several-year run, which was better than what most of DC was doing. But I have to say that one of the things that Ginny and I did a kind of a standard, and I'm not ashamed of it at all, kind of a standard werewolf, kind of, he has a curse and he's 3 nights a month, he's going to run around, do this. Okay, so we've set that up and then Gerry could take it. But the funny thing is, when I started looking through the stories Gerry wrote with Plug over the next few months or so, 6 months or so that he was, or whatever, that he was doing the book, he did whether it was on the West Coast or East Coast, he did the damn strangest things. Somebody was working on some other show just a few weeks ago, maybe it was to him, somebody else, that they were these crazy stories. They had mad monks and lost castles and monasteries. Where were these things all over the West Coast or East Coast? Where was Gerry? He'd go from one secret cult to another secret cult. It's like they were all over the United States or something like that. And it was kind of strange, but I think in some ways it sort of took it, and we had thought of we were thinking kind of a mundane werewolf story, and Gerry took it over to this weird world of the mad monks, and so forth. And why did you do that, Gerry? I mean, I didn't care once I gave the book up, as long as it sold. I was happy to have Gerry do whatever the hell he wanted to. I just didn't want to do anything except just say yes and write a couple of lines for the covers. But why did you go to the idea of all these monks and monasteries and all that you did that year?
I maybe it's because I was influenced, as I said, by reading a lot of Lovecraft at that time, and Gothic stories in general. But I just found it fun, I mean, I was looking to keep it fun for myself, and not fall into the monster of the week, or a continuing thing just felt natural to me. And you let me do it. So, it's like, as long as Roy's happy, I'm happy, it's like,
I have other things to do. But one thing, we were talking about the code a while ago. When I was looking over that first issue, there's at least 2 or 3 people killed by the werewolf.
Yeah. Right away.
He had a body count.
The werewolf killed 2 or 3 people. We don't know if they were psychotic killers or the mailman, But I mean, he was that's. I was surprised we didn't. In retrospect, I'm surprised the comics code didn't give us trouble. We were having this hero who's killing people and getting away with it. I had trouble even with Conan on that.
There's a lot of stuff that you got by. Jacob and I have been like in that same Mad Monk story. I think he has a mist that makes people's flesh melt off their bones. And we look at each other and say, "How is this getting past the code?" Horrifying. I love it.
They'd given up by that point.
So Gene, were you the one interfacing with the people at the code who was ever dealing with the code when those notes would come back? Who would they go through?
Well, I think I just had to forward them to Roy or whoever was editing.
And would they come in the form of a letter, or was it a phone call, or how would they give you notes?
No, I think they were written.
Wow.
Yeah.
I think they were written, and I think they would reference specific drawings, right? I mean, it was always a specific, and I'm sorry, I focus on the fact that they were constantly raising necklines and lowering hems.
So is that when something would come back and there'd have to be a last minute change to make them happy? Was that where you get a lot of the notes that says John Romita Sr. came in and fixed this thing or that thing?
I mean, that's what what people did in the office. They quickly, right? Isn't that who? Yeah, we
didn't have time to have the original artist come in usually. So John Romita was there as sort of an unofficial art director practically, except Stan didn't like to give up that title.
Right.
And Herb Trippy was there by that time, Marie Severin. These people were in the office. They were talented artists, and they just give it to whoever happened to be available. Sometimes another art might just be passing through or get waylaid. Just for the hell of it, I once drew a palm tree in a story just to see what Frank Giacchino would ink it like, and so forth. I mean, they do crazy things like that, and so he did a good job, made me look good. But
and were they consistent with their comment? I mean, with the comments, were they consistent with comments?
Not 100%. Censors are never 100%. You'd be
like, wait, they let this thing through, but not this.
No, they're never 100% consistent. You can't really expect it because no two things are exactly equivalent. But we would use that, sure. Hey, you let this get away, but you couldn't push too hard because otherwise they'll push back and nothing will get through.
Yeah,
Remember,
and so you had me not. Luckily, we had this. The original. I think had been an awful guy in the 50s, a hanging judge type called Judge Murphy, who they brought in, when they really wanted to show that they meant business, with the code. And he was just awful, evidently. But by the time I came, a society lady, the first 6 months or year I was there was a society lady who had been in charge for 5 or 6 years with the perfect name for a comic book censor, you'd think, out of society. Mrs. Guy Percy Truelock. I mean, there's a picture of her. She looks, it doesn't need color, but I'm sure she has blue hair. And, she looks just exactly like Mrs. Guy Percy Truelock should look. And when she quit in, by 66, the turn of 66 at least, then Len Darbin, who was the lawyer,
I remember the man.
And he was a pretty reasonable guy, really. I remember you and I went out to lunch with him or dinner a time or two. He was a nice guy. Yeah, and he let us get away with a few things in Conan and the horror books, I think, that he didn't do in the superhero books because he thought they had different audiences. I'm sorry, Jeannie.
But I think there always was a lot of Marvel quoting precedent or attempting to set precedent and then quote, you let this go by, now let this pass.
Right. So, and the code didn't completely disappear; it just loosened, right? And at one point, it must have just gone away.
But that's only about 5 or 10 years ago.
Okay, yeah.
It was officially, gradually one company after another until finally, I think only Marvel or something was in the code. But in the meantime, in the 70s, it became loosened, but it was still a factor through the 70s and into the 80s, at least, to a great extent. But
so it wasn't like
by the 90s, so forth, it was starting to really, they didn't object to much of anything after about the 90s or so,
Yeah, that became obvious.
Yeah.
So let's get to the real meat of this thing. I want to know. I'm still trying to figure out why anybody dared name a werewolf Jack Russell.
I was just going to say we can't end this conversation without the hot potato being in one of your hands. I thought we get you guys in the same virtual room. Somebody's going to own this.
Yeah, this has been a debate for years, so one of you guys has to take credit for it.
Jeannie and I had a name for him in our story. Do you remember, Jeannie?
I don't.
I don't think we
but
named
it's very
him
funny because I don't remember that Jack Russell was a dog. I only learned that many years later.
Me too,
As a matter of fact, I had little terriers when I was a kid. But I didn't even know they were called Jack Russells.
And Gerry said he didn't know that it was a dog either. Right, Gerry?
Yeah, I think that, I was oblivious, and I think the first time that I found out that Jack Russell was a dog was when a fan asked me why it was named Jack Russell, and I was like, why? Why do you ask? And said, because it's the name of a dog. I'm like, oh, that's right, Jack Russell Terrier. So, I could own it, but I wouldn't say that I had conscious, it was not a conscious choice.
That's fair.
And somewhere along the line, just the name Russell obviously had some meaning because it was based on that original Eastern European name.
Right.
So it's an anglicized version.
Yeah.
So I don't know which came first.
Yeah. It's going to remain a mystery.
I would love to ask you, everyone knows you for your work, which is outstanding. But at that time in the 70s, when you were not working, what were you doing to fill your creative energies? to keep yourself going? Because I know there's, as a creative person, there's things I have to do outside of my work. And I'm just curious for you, like, what were your interests outside of work?
Oh, me?
All of you. Yes. Yes.
Well, I was finishing college, and I had gone back to college in my early 20s, and I was really very serious originally about pursuing a career in clinical psychology.
Wow.
So that's what I was doing. I was taking a lot of classes. Even when I was working,
all of this. Wow.
So even when I was working at Marvel as Stanley's secretary, I was taking night courses at Hunter because it was only 10 blocks away. So I could finish work and then go up to Hunter. I had to take a couple of retake courses like trigonometry and some extra semesters of French because they didn't count the stuff that I had taken in Missouri. So that's what I was doing. I was taking classes.
Is that in between the tear gassing?
Oh yeah, I got tear gassed, but that.
Wait, what?
I mean, it was the 60s. That was
the
70s.
60s. Come on.
It was,
Everyone got tear gassed. Come
well,
on.
actually, I think actually more it was like 1970 or something. It was the year that the colleges really all shut down and were protesting.
Right.
And I wasn't, I hate to say this, I was not even really in a protest. I mean, I just happened to be trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time when.
That's what they all say.
Yeah.
Sure.
How about you guys? What was going on in your lives outside of work that was keeping you fulfilled creatively to allow you to go in and keep creating?
I watched a lot of movies. I went to, fortunately, it was a great decade for movies. And I actually, my hobby was buying 16 millimeter copies of dupes of movies and showing them to small groups of people. So this was a very expensive hobby at that time.
Yeah.
I think we buy now for like $10, if you want to online. Were costing $200 back in 1971.
Wow.
So yeah. But
Amazing.
I guess I could say that I was wasting my money. That was my hobby.
No, you're not. I actually collected 16 millimeter films as well for a long time, and I just recently donated them to the Academy. They put them in their vaults. They can have them because they're just sitting in my shed. But I understand that obsession very well. How about you, Roy?
Well, as Jeannie could probably testify, I was never very far from the idea of thinking about comic books. I mean, for one thing, she worked in the office a little, and Gerry was around the office a lot. But I had at least anywhere from 5 to then 2 or 3 day a week job, in addition to the writing, which I had to do outside those offices. So I didn't really have a lot of time when it was always kind of, on the back burner, but of course I love going to Broadway plays. We went to as many Broadway plays as if we could manage. I love movies, went to, movies from the time I went there, several nights a week, if I could manage it, and a Broadway play the other night. And I read a lot, as Gerry and Jean did too. I read a lot, by that time, I think I was coming closer and closer to abandoning fiction. I haven't read much fiction in the last 30 or 40 years, but I love reading history and biography, a little bit of fiction and so forth. But, there were just the usual interests that all of us had. I think Gerry and I and Jean and Len and Marv and all those people, we all sort of had a lot of the same things in common. Some of us like mysteries more, some of us like science fiction, some of us like this or that. But we all, and a lot of the movies were the same movies we went to see. And it's funny though, but out of this thing came a lot of different things. I mean, what Gerry got out of a movie and gave to comics, and what I got out or what Jean got out and others, it was all same. We all processed it through our minds, and then it would come out in some other form.
Yeah. And that's what fascinates me about, just growing up and thinking back at your influences and how they then manifested themselves in your work. And for me, it just making Werewolf by Night is exactly what you just said. I mean, I had that in my head for years, you know, since I was a kid, and to be able to then bring it out in a different way was a lot of fun to do that. And but how about now? Now, what are you doing to satisfy your creative energies? What's happening now?
Well, Roy publishes Alter Ego, and
Yep.
You know, my impression is that takes up 90% of your day.
Yeah, but I think I make 30 or 40 cents an hour, I think, for the time I
Well, it's a labor of love. It's obvious.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's a
we love
labor
it.
of love. Yeah, I lived my life sideways. I started off doing fanzines. I got in the field for years, and then when it began to dry up a little, I decided, well, what did I really enjoy? I said, well, I used to like doing those fanzines, and I, got in, so I did. And I don't know, I still like to write an occasional comic. I would love to have one comic book a month to write, but when I get an offer from Marvel, I haven't had a DC here, but when I get an offer from Marvel, it's usually one story or it's a couple of issues or something. But I can't get very interested in that, because by the time I get interested, it's over. It takes me an issue or two to kind of warm up to something. So a 2-issue series is a big yawn to me, and so because but if I had a monthly book, I'd really devote time to it. But 1 or 2 issues, it's just kind of a waste. So as a result, I sort of like to keep my hand in to keep my name a little better known. But basically, I just work on Alter Ego, and I read. I go to an occasional movie now, mostly now, watch streaming and other stuff like that. And I read. It's the same damn stuff I've done all my life. It's just that I used to do it in New York City, and now I do it on a 40-acre farm. It's the only difference in my life, really.
Jean, are you still writing? Are you doing?
No, I spent some time doing things in New York that I was never able to do all the years that I was working.
Yeah.
I go to this array of unusual concerts. I'm a big fan of what's called early music, music before 1820.
Yep.
So it's before the era of classical music. I'm a big fan of that. I have memberships in the museums, and I probably go to an exhibit once every week or two. And so I never have to spend like all exhausting day going to the museum. I'll go to one and then okay, that was lovely. Go back the next week and see the next one. But all sorts of things I never even knew existed in New York.
Yeah.
Just a couple weeks ago, I found out about School of Visual Arts has a gallery in Chelsea on West 26th Street and 11th Avenue.
Yeah.
And they had an exhibit of 75 years of School of Visual Arts posters. And I even sent a couple pictures to Roy that originally School of Visual Arts was called the Cartoonists and Illustrators School.
That's right.
And it was just amazing. I mean,
that's where I went to school.
Did you?
I graduated from the School of Visual Arts. Yep. SVA. Loved it.
Both so lucky to have able to spend time in New York.
Yeah.
I mean, and Jeannie, you're really taking advantage of it. I envy you.
Well, I take the bus everywhere. I have to tell you, I really cut back on taking the subway.
Hey, there are buses. They get you places.
They do. I can get anywhere on my Metro card for $1.45.
Yep.
Amazing.
Before we ask you asked Gerry about his life. I should also mention that the one other thing I do I got back in the last few years is that I do more comics conventions now. They got to the point where it's possible to make a couple of bucks, go into a comic convention, signing all the rest. Why people want somebody's autograph? The only thing I ever collected was the two guys who ever recorded High Noon, Frankie Lane and Tex Ritter. But I never was. But if people want to go, I go. And my manager John Cimino is always booking me into these places. Heading down to Brazil in a couple of weeks for a few days. Wow. It's too dangerous to go out at night, and in day I'll be stuck in a building, so I'll never see anything except maybe there's a palm tree in the distance, probably. But I enjoy doing that, and either that. So if I see a city it's I mean, I don't know if I went out next to New York, but in March I'm supposed to go to Fargo, North Dakota. So
in March.
Thing. Yeah, it's in early March. Yeah, right. But anyway, that's one of the other things that I do. That can be kind of fun.
Yeah, no, it's always fun, I think, to reach out, especially to fans who, and most of them are always incredibly nice, and you realize sort of what this means to them. Sometimes we take it for granted, but when you see it in through the eyes of someone else, you're always reminded about how important that work is that you do. Jerry, what's keeping you busy these days?
Well, I'm still recovering from a year of health issues. But I'm hoping to get back into traveling next year. That's the thing I love to do. I actually, one of the reasons I like going to conventions is getting out of the house and being in a new place, meeting the fans, hanging out. I'm not a naturally social person. But for some reason, conventions create this atmosphere that where I like traveling. So yeah,
that's great.
Cool.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much for your time. We can't thank you enough. It was wonderful to hear it straight from your mouths, all this amazing history, and to have had a chance to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Hey, before you go, I want to say that as soon as Jerry's feeling a little better, and if Gene decides that someplace better than the subway to go, that we should all get together at a convention and take this show on the road.
There you go.
I think that would be amazing. That would be great. It's just wonderful to see the three of you together here, even like this. It's wonderful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very so much for having us.
Mark Wilson and I have been pitching. We've been pitching to ourselves a duo, which we would pitch as Not Dead Yet.
There you go.
We'd like to thank Jerry, Roy, and Gene for agreeing to come on and chat with us. And thanks to John for reaching out to Gene. And of course, big thanks to Michael Giacchino, who made all of this happen.
Yes, thank you, Michael. And if you're hearing this on our podcast feed, just know that we shared the video version of this conversation with our PAC members and Star Gods on Patreon. Those supporters always get early access to all of our bonus material. This will eventually be made public on our YouTube channel. But if you'd like to support the show, get access to the weekly bonus show and cool exclusives, please visit patreon.com/Bronze Age Monsters. Until we talk to you again, stay bronze, Pony Boy. Stay bronze.